In a quiet park, a blind man's life would change forever with one daring act of courage. But what followed would leave everyone questioning their perceptions and their hearts. When a blind man rushed into traffic to save a child, no one could have predicted the storm that would follow. Accused of recklessness and facing a family secret, Thomas's world was torn apart. But as the truth unraveled, one question remained. Could forgiveness heal the wounds of the past? What happens next will shock you. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. Thomas was a man who had learned to live in a world of sound and touch. In his mid-40s, he moved through a suburban neighborhood with quiet confidence, guided by his loyal companion, Daisy, a golden retriever with an unshakable sense of duty. The town he called home was peaceful, its streets lined with maple trees that whispered secrets to the wind, and neighbors who often waved, though they knew he couldn't see them. Each morning, Thomas ventured out for a walk, his cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement. The world came alive for him through the rustle of leaves, the hum of passing cars, and the chirping of sparrows. He wasn't always blind. Once, he was a musician, playing piano to adoring audiences, until a tragic accident stole both his vision and his sense of purpose. For years, he'd withdrawn, retreating into a shell of solitude, until Daisy entered his life, nudging him toward the light again. The park was his sanctuary, a place where he felt most connected to the life he could no longer see. Children's laughter filled the air, mingling with the soft murmur of parents chatting on benches. The smell of freshly cut grass and the distant aroma of roasted peanuts from a vendor painted vivid pictures in his mind. Thomas often sat on his favorite bench, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, while Daisy lay at his feet, ever vigilant. There was something about that day, something different. As Thomas approached the park, he felt a subtle tension in the air. Daisy seemed more alert, her ears perking up as she tugged gently on her leash. The familiar sounds of the park felt sharper, almost urgent, as if the world was holding its breath. Though he couldn't pinpoint the source, Thomas's instincts told him something unusual was about to happen. And he was right. The park was alive with its usual symphony of sounds. Children laughing, dogs barking, and the distant hum of traffic. Grace, a young mother juggling too much at once, walked briskly along the pathway. Her phone pressed against her ear. She balanced a conversation about work while half-heartedly calling after her son, Charlie, who skipped ahead. Oblivious to the dangers around him, Charlie's attention was caught by a bright red ball bouncing toward the street. Grace, distracted by the conversation, didn't notice as her little boy followed the ball, weaving through the crowd. The faint sound of squealing tires mixed with the laughter of children, creating a dissonance that went unnoticed by most. But not by Thomas. Sitting on his usual bench, Thomas's senses sharpened. Daisy, his guide dog, let out a sharp bark and strained at her leash, pulling toward the source of the disturbance. "What is it, girl?" he murmured, rising to his feet. He listened closely, sorting through the noise. Amid the joyful chaos, there was something off. A mother's voice, sharp and frantic, calling for her child. Thomas gripped his cane tightly, his heart pounding as he tried to piece together the scene. He heard a child's footsteps, quick and light, heading toward the road. The faint rumble of an approaching car sent a chill down his spine. Someone's in trouble, he thought, his instincts urging him to act. Nearby onlookers froze in shock, their voices mixing into a chorus of gasps and cries. Some reached out helplessly, but no one moved. The car's engine roared louder, and time seemed to slow as the scene unfolded. Grace dropped her phone, screaming Charlie's name as she realized her son was steps away from danger. Thomas's world became a blur of sound and movement. "Daisy, forward," he commanded, trusting her to guide him. The tug on the leash was strong, and his cane tapped against the ground, guiding his steps with urgency. Every sound, the screech of tires, the cries of bystanders, and the frantic barking of Daisy, pushed him to move faster as the car sped closer. The crowd seemed paralyzed, their collective fear rooting them in place. Only Thomas moved, his mind racing as he tried to gauge the distance and direction of the danger. For him, the world was darkness, but his resolve shone bright. A child's life was at stake, and he was determined to act. Thomas barely had a moment to think before his instincts kicked in. He made the split-second decision to act, trusting Daisy and his finely tuned senses to guide him. "Daisy, forward," he commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos. The dog surged ahead, her leash taut as she led him through the crowded park. Each step was a gamble. Thomas couldn't see the uneven terrain beneath him, but he could feel the subtle vibrations of Daisy's movement and hear the sharp intake of panicked breaths around him. His cane tapped frantically against the ground, searching for obstacles, while his ears strained to pinpoint the child's location. Grace's desperate cries pierced through the cacophony. "Charlie, stop! Come back!" Ahead, Charlie remained blissfully unaware of the looming danger. He clutched the red ball tightly, giggling as he neared the curb, the sound of the approaching car drowned out by his own excitement. Grace's screams grew louder, but they didn't register with the boy. Thomas's heart raced as he pushed forward, weaving around park benches, startled bystanders, and a trash can he narrowly avoided. His mind worked furiously to calculate the distance to the road based on the escalating roar of the car's engine. Each second felt like an eternity. Grace stumbled after her son, her hands outstretched, but she was too far away. Her voice cracked with panic as she pleaded for someone to help. The onlookers remained frozen, their faces pale, watching in horror as the car sped closer. Thomas was running now, his grip firm on Daisy's leash. The sharp tug from his guide dog gave him just enough time to sidestep a low barrier in his path. He felt his foot slip momentarily on loose gravel, but caught himself, his momentum unbroken. The sound of tires screeching grew louder, more menacing. "Charlie!" he shouted, hoping to startle the boy into stopping. But Charlie was too young to recognize the urgency in the stranger's voice. The car was almost upon them, its engine a deafening roar in Thomas's ears. He could feel the vibration of its approach, the rush of air as it drew closer. Thomas lunged forward, guided only by the sound of the boy's laughter and Daisy's desperate pull. As he reached out, the world seemed to hold its breath. His fingers brushed against something small and solid, Charlie's arm. In one swift motion, Thomas yanked the boy back just as the car sped past, its tires skidding violently. The impact didn't come, but the moment left the air electric with tension. The silence that followed was broken only by Grace's sobbing and the low growl of the car's engine fading into the distance. Thomas held Charlie tightly, his breath ragged as he tried to steady himself. Had he been a second too late, the outcome would have been unthinkable. The moment Thomas yanked Charlie away from the street, the roar of the speeding car was interrupted by the piercing screech of brakes. A deafening crash followed, the sound reverberating through the park. Everyone froze, their collective breath caught in their chests. The metallic crunch and shattering glass painted an unseen picture of devastation, just beyond Thomas's reach. Thomas dropped to his knees, cradling the trembling child. Charlie clung to him, his tiny hands gripping Thomas's shirt as tears streamed down his face. The boy's earlier laughter had been replaced by muffled sobs, his innocence shaken by the close brush with danger. Daisy stood by Thomas's side, panting heavily but alert, her job far from over. "Charlie!" Grace's anguished scream broke through the stunned silence. She sprinted toward them, her face pale and streaked with tears. She dropped to the ground beside her son, pulling him into a tight embrace. "Oh, my baby, are you okay? Are you hurt?" she asked frantically, her voice cracking with relief and guilt. Thomas, still catching his breath, tried to reassure her. He's fine. Just scared, he managed, his voice low and steady. But the reprieve was short-lived. From the direction of the crash came the sound of a car door slamming, followed by heavy footsteps. An angry voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a blade. "What were you thinking?" Thomas turned his head toward the source, his brow furrowing. The voice, sharp and accusing, grew louder as it approached. "You could have killed someone. This is your fault." The accusation hung in the air, electrifying the scene. Bystanders murmured amongst themselves, some agreeing, others defending Thomas's bravery. Grace looked up at the approaching figure, her relief turning to confusion and fear as the man gestured angrily toward Thomas. Thomas's grip tightened on his cane as he straightened, his jaw set. Though he couldn't see the man, he could hear the fury in his voice and the shuffling of feet as people stepped back to watch the confrontation unfold. As the camera zoomed out, the chaotic scene came into focus. The wrecked car, a shaken crowd, and Thomas standing firm, a blind man who had just risked everything to save a child, now facing accusations instead of gratitude. The tension lingered, leaving viewers questioning what would happen next. Would Thomas's actions be celebrated, or would he face unjust blame for the chaos that followed? The angry voice grew louder, cutting through the murmurs of the gathered crowd. It belonged to the driver of the car, a middle-aged man in a suit whose face was flushed with frustration. He stormed toward Thomas, gesturing wildly at the scene behind him, a sedan with its front crumpled against a lamppost. What were you thinking?" the man shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Thomas. "You ran into the street without looking, and now look what's happened. You could have caused a worse accident." Thomas stiffened, gripping his cane tightly. Though his face remained calm, a faint tremor in his hand betrayed his nerves. "I didn't run into the street," he said evenly, his voice steady despite the accusation. "I heard a child in danger and acted to save him." The crowd, initially silent, began to stir with whispers and fragmented opinions. Some stepped forward to defend Thomas. "He saved that boy's life," a young woman said, gesturing toward Grace and Charlie. "That car was speeding. What else was he supposed to do?" "That doesn't excuse the chaos he caused," another man retorted, siding with the driver. "Someone could have gotten seriously hurt." Amid the back and forth, Grace knelt by Charlie, holding him close. Tears streamed down her face, her voice shaky as she turned to Thomas. I don't know how to thank you. You saved my son. She choked on her words, guilt weighing heavily on her. "This is my fault. I should have been watching him." Thomas turned his head slightly toward Grace's voice, softening his tone. "He's safe now. That's what matters." But the tension only grew as the driver crossed his arms, glaring at Thomas. "Safe? Look at my car. Who's going to pay for this? You're blind. You had no idea what you were doing." The word stung, and a visible ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Thomas's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "I may not see, but I can hear. And I knew that child was in danger. If I hadn't acted, the outcome could have been far worse." Grace looked up at the driver, her expression a mix of shame and indignation. "You were speeding. If anyone's to blame, it's you. My son is alive because of this man." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, splitting into factions. Some sided with Grace and Thomas, commending his bravery, while others echoed the driver's concerns, questioning whether Thomas's actions had been reckless. Thomas stood firm, but the weight of the accusations was palpable. Daisy remained by his side, her presence grounding him as the heated debate swirled around them. The unease in the air was thick, and it was clear this confrontation was far from over. What had begun as an act of heroism now threatened to spiral into something far more complicated, leaving Thomas to navigate not just the aftermath of the accident, but the doubt and judgment of those around him. The crowd's divided whispers were interrupted by a calm but authoritative voice. "That's enough," said Sarah, a retired nurse who had been standing near the scene. She stepped forward, her silver hair catching the sunlight as she placed herself between Thomas and the angry driver. "This man just saved a child's life," she said firmly, her eyes meeting the driver's with quiet resolve. "Instead of pointing fingers, we should be grateful no one was seriously hurt." The driver hesitated, clearly thrown off by Sarah's unwavering demeanor, but he muttered under his breath and took a step back. Sarah turned to Thomas, her expression softening. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. Thomas nodded slightly, his grip on his cane loosening as he responded. "I'm fine. Thank you." He could hear the kindness in her tone, a stark contrast to the hostility from moments before. Meanwhile, Grace sat on the grass with Charlie still clinging to her. Her guilt was almost suffocating as she replayed the events in her mind. The thought of how close she'd come to losing her son was unbearable, and the judgmental stares from some in the crowd only deepened her shame. She glanced at Thomas, her savior, and felt an overwhelming mixture of gratitude and regret. "I should have been watching him," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "None of this would have happened if I had." Charlie, sensing his mother's distress, looked up at her with wide eyes. "Mommy, he helped me," he said quietly, pointing at Thomas. Grace blinked back tears, her attention shifting to Thomas. "Yes, he did, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice breaking. She stood up, holding Charlie's hand, and walked over to Thomas and Daisy. "Thank you," she said, her words carrying the weight of her emotions. "I don't know how to repay you." Thomas shook his head. "No repayment is needed. I'm just glad he's safe." Charlie peered up at Thomas, his small hand reaching out hesitantly. "Thank you," he said, his voice shy but sincere. Thomas knelt slightly, extending his hand in response. The boy grasped it, and for a moment, the tension around them seemed to dissolve. Nearby, Daisy wagged her tail and nudged Charlie gently with her nose, sensing his nervousness. "Your dog is nice," Charlie said, his smile returning for the first time since the incident. "She's a hero, just like Thomas," Sarah said, kneeling down to pat Daisy. "A loyal companion and a good judge of character." Daisy gave a soft bark, her tail wagging enthusiastically, drawing a few smiles from the onlookers. The moment was small but powerful, as connections began to form amidst the chaos. Grace found herself standing a little taller, bolstered by Sarah's quiet support and Charlie's renewed cheer. For Thomas, the simple act of holding Charlie's hand was a reminder of why he had acted so instinctively. Yet, the lingering presence of the driver in the divided crowd hinted that their troubles were far from over. The bonds forming now would soon be tested in ways no one expected. The tension in the air thickened as a sleek black SUV screeched to a halt near the park. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, his expression dark and intense. Adam, Grace's husband, scanned the scene, his eyes locking onto his wife and son before shifting to Thomas. His face hardened, misunderstanding the situation entirely. "Grace," Adam called out, his voice sharp with worry and anger. He stormed over, scooping Charlie into his arms while Grace tried to explain. "What happened? Are you okay? What is going on?" Grace's voice trembled as she recounted the events. "Charlie, he wandered toward the street and this man," she motioned toward Thomas, "saved him. He pulled him back just in time." Adam's gaze turned to Thomas, his eyes narrowing. "This man," he repeated, his tone laced with suspicion. "And where were you, Grace? How could you let this happen?" Grace flinched, her guilt already overwhelming. "I was distracted. I wasn't paying attention." Thomas, sensing the hostility in Adam's voice, straightened. "Your son is safe," he said calmly, though the accusation in Adam's tone didn't escape him. "That's what matters." Before Adam could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. A police cruiser pulled up alongside the park, and 2 officers stepped out, surveying the scene. They approached the crowd, their presence immediately commanding attention. "We received a call about an accident," one officer said, his gaze moving from the wrecked car to the gathering. "Can someone explain what happened here?" The driver of the car wasted no time stepping forward. "That man," he said, pointing at Thomas, "caused this mess. He ran into the street and spooked me. I had to swerve to avoid hitting him." "That's not true," Sarah interjected, her voice firm. "Thomas didn't run into the street. He acted to save a child who was in danger." The officer raised a hand to calm the rising voices. "We'll get statements from everyone. Let's keep this orderly." As the officers began asking questions, whispers rippled through the crowd. Was it reckless for him to intervene? He's blind. How could he know what he was doing? Thomas overheard fragments of the murmurs, each one chipping away at his confidence. Doubt crept in as he replayed the events in his mind. Had he truly acted heroically, or had his actions caused more harm than good? Adam, meanwhile, was far from convinced. "You expect me to believe this blind man just knew what to do," he said, his tone cold. "What if he'd gotten my son hurt? Or worse?" Thomas's jaw tightened, his calm exterior beginning to crack. "I did what I had to do," he replied, his voice low but firm. "And you think that's enough?" Adam shot back. "You risked his life, and everyone else's in the process." The exchange grew more heated, drawing the attention of the officers and onlookers. Grace stepped between them, her voice shaking as she pleaded, "Adam, stop. He saved Charlie. That's what's important." But Adam wasn't ready to back down, his mistrust and frustration fueling the conflict. The scene simmered with unresolved tension, leaving everyone questioning how or if the situation would be resolved peacefully. The exchange between Adam and Thomas lingered in the air long after the officers had finished their questioning. Grace, still shaken by the events, felt the weight of the conflict between her husband and the man who had saved their son. She glanced at Adam, her expression softening as she realized the rift that had formed. "I think we should invite Thomas to dinner," Grace suggested quietly, her voice trembling. "We owe him. I want to thank him properly, Adam. He saved Charlie's life." Adam's eyes flashed with disbelief and irritation. "Dinner? After everything that's happened?" He shot a glance at Thomas, his mistrust evident. "I'm not sure I'm ready to have this man in our home." Grace's face flushed with frustration. "He's not the enemy, Adam. He did something brave. You need to see that." Thomas, sensing the tension between them, took a step back. "I don't want to cause more trouble," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "I'll be fine. You've thanked me enough." But Grace wasn't giving up. She stepped closer to Thomas, her gaze pleading. "Please, just come. It's the least we can do." After a moment of hesitation, Thomas nodded. "Okay," he agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll come." The decision made, Grace tried to smooth things over with Adam, but the tension in the air was palpable as they all headed home. Thomas's mind raced as he wondered what the evening would hold. He hadn't expected to be welcomed with open arms, but part of him hoped that perhaps this dinner would allow for some reconciliation, or at the very least, some understanding. When they arrived at the house, Adam was quieter than usual, his arms crossed as he led the way inside. The dinner table was set in silence, with Grace trying to make small talk while Adam remained distant, his eyes rarely meeting Thomas's. As they sat down to eat, the atmosphere was strained. Grace smiled weakly at Thomas, her gratitude clear but overshadowed by the tension between her and her husband. "This is really kind of you," she said, trying to break the silence. "I know it's not easy, but we just want you to know how much we appreciate everything." Thomas nodded, though he could feel the weight of Adam's scrutiny. "I'm just glad I could help." Just as they began to settle into the awkward meal, Charlie, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "Mommy, Daddy," he began hesitantly. "Why didn't you ever tell me about Thomas?" Grace froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Adam's expression tightened as he glanced at his son. "What do you mean, Charlie?" The room went still. Charlie's innocent question hung in the air, unanswered for a moment. I know him, the boy continued, looking at Thomas. He's the one who played music at the park. The one with the piano. I remember him. The room seemed to shift. Grace's face drained of color as she glanced nervously at Adam. Charlie, what are you talking about? She asked, her voice a little too high-pitched. Thomas felt a cold chill wash over him, the familiar dread creeping up his spine. I used to play at the park sometimes, he said slowly, his voice uncertain. A long time ago. Grace shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting to Adam. That's not important right now, Charlie. But it was too late. Adam's eyes had narrowed as the pieces fell into place. You used to play music there? He asked, his voice growing colder. Thomas's heart began to race, the tension thickening. He had no idea what was coming, but he sensed that something was off. Yes, but Adam interrupted, his voice sharp. Why didn't you tell me? Grace's face was pale now, her hands trembling as she tried to explain. It wasn't the right time to bring it up, Adam. I was just trying to protect. But before she could finish, the doorbell rang, cutting off the conversation. The unexpected interruption left the room frozen, all eyes on the door as the camera zoomed in on the shocked expressions at the table. The twist had come, and the revelation of a hidden past threatened to unravel everything. As the door creaked open, the viewers were left in suspense, wondering who or what had just entered, and what truth was about to be revealed. The door creaked open, and all eyes turned toward it. The figure standing in the doorway was an unexpected sight. An elderly man, his face weathered with age but his expression sharp and filled with quiet intensity. He stepped inside, looking at Thomas and then at Adam with a mixture of recognition and disbelief. Adam. It's been a long time, the man said, his voice steady yet heavy with years of unspoken tension. Adam's face hardened at the sight of him. What are you doing here? His voice was low, filled with an edge that sent a ripple of unease through the room. Grace's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat as she exchanged a nervous glance with Thomas. Who is this? She asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer her directly, instead fixing his gaze on Thomas. I thought I'd never see you again, he said, his words sending an icy chill through the room. Dad, you can't just show up here after all these years, Adam spat, his fists clenched at his sides. Especially not now. Thomas felt a knot tighten in his stomach, an eerie sense of dread creeping up his spine. He had no idea who this man was or why he felt so connected to the situation, but the tension between Adam and him was unmistakable. I think it's time to finally talk, the man said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Adam. You've been carrying this for too long. Adam's face twisted with frustration. I told you, never again. This is not the time, and it's not the place. But the man persisted, his voice cutting through the tension. You can't keep running from the truth, Adam. It's time to face what happened. A cold silence settled over the room. The stranger's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, waiting to burst. And then, as if the floodgates had been opened, Adam finally spoke. His words were heavy with anger and regret, a past that had been buried for too long finally coming to light. It's him. It's Thomas, Adam said, his voice thick with emotion. He's the reason everything happened. The revelation hit like a punch to the gut. Thomas's heart skipped a beat as he struggled to process Adam's words. What was Adam talking about? What had Thomas done to cause such a rift between them? Before Thomas could respond, the man, Adam's father, it seemed, stepped forward, his face now filled with sorrow. Let's go back to the beginning. Adam's right. It's time for you to know the truth. The scene shifted abruptly, and the room seemed to fade away as a flashback unfolded. The screen darkened, the years melting away as the image of a younger Adam appeared, alongside a young Thomas, standing in a vibrant park just like the one they were in now. It was a day of celebration. Thomas, vibrant and full of life, had just completed a performance at the park's summer concert series. The music had been the heart of the day, drawing crowds of families and children, all basking in the warm sunshine. Adam was there too, watching from the sidelines. But the atmosphere, so full of life and joy, turned to chaos in an instant. A car, a sleek, black sedan, raced down the street, its tires screeching against the pavement as it lost control. Thomas was standing near the edge of the road, blissfully unaware, his guide dog Daisy sitting loyally by his side. Adam, who had been standing farther away, saw the car coming. He panicked, but in his rush to act, he misjudged the situation. The car swerved uncontrollably, colliding with Thomas and Daisy. The impact sent Thomas crashing to the ground, his world instantly plunging into darkness. Daisy had miraculously survived, but Thomas had lost everything. Adam, frozen in shock, had been unable to reach him in time. His own guilt had been a heavy burden, one that he had never been able to escape. He blamed Thomas, not for the accident itself, but for his inability to stop it. He had blamed Thomas for the loss of their shared future, for the darkness that had consumed both of their lives. As the flashback ended, the tension in the room was palpable. The air was thick with the weight of their shared history, a tragedy that had remained unsaid for far too long. Adam's resentment hung in the air, festering like an open wound. Thomas stood frozen, his mind racing. He had no idea that the man who had just saved Charlie's life was the same one who had once held such a deep grudge against him. Now, standing face to face with the father of the very man he had tried to help, he had to confront the painful truth of their tangled past. The room was silent, the shared pain between them building to a crescendo. Would this moment lead to healing, or would it tear them apart even further? The weight of the past loomed large, and neither man knew if they could ever truly move beyond it. The twist had changed everything, and now, the story was no longer just about Thomas's heroism. It was about facing the ghost of a tragic past and deciding whether forgiveness could ever truly take hold. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the weight of Adam's revelation. Thomas stood frozen, his mind reeling from the flood of memories that the flashback had unearthed. The young Thomas, once vibrant and full of hope, was now just a shadow of that person, his sight lost, his world plunged into darkness. But the man in front of him, Adam, carried a bitterness that Thomas had never imagined would be linked to that day. Silence hung in the room like an oppressive cloud. Thomas didn't know what to say. His thoughts raced, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He could feel the walls closing in around him, the weight of Adam's anger and the guilt that had defined their past pressing heavily on his chest. For the first time in years, Thomas felt small, unsure of himself. He turned his head slowly towards Sarah, who had been a quiet presence during the confrontation. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with understanding, yet tinged with concern. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked softly, her voice almost a whisper. Thomas didn't answer immediately. His mind was too full of conflicting emotions. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice strained but steady. "I need to know the truth," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "I need to understand what really happened. I need to know if there was something I missed, something I could have done differently." Sarah nodded, sensing his resolve. "You don't have to face this alone, Thomas," she said gently. "I'll help you find the answers you need." The room was still, and as Thomas processed everything, he began to feel a stirring deep within him. The self-doubt, the fears that had crept into his heart over the years, slowly began to recede. There was a fire inside him that hadn't been extinguished, even by the darkness he'd endured. He had to push through the pain, confront the truth, and find the courage to face the man who had once been a stranger to him, but was now inextricably tied to his fate. Grace, who had been silent until now, looked at Thomas with a mixture of sympathy and newfound respect. She could see the determination in his eyes, the strength he was beginning to rediscover. Her voice, when it came, was soft but resolute. "Thomas, you don't have to explain yourself to anyone. What you did, saving Charlie, was brave. Adam needs to see that. He needs to understand. She turned toward her husband, her gaze firm. You've carried this anger for so long, Adam. You're hurting both of you, and it's not helping anyone. It's time to let go. Adam was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Thomas, who met his gaze without flinching. There was still so much anger between them, so much unresolved pain. But for the first time, Thomas could see a crack in the wall Adam had built around himself. Taking a deep breath, Thomas made a decision. He wouldn't wait for Adam to come to him. He would uncover the truth himself. It was the only way forward. Later that night, Thomas sat alone in his small apartment, his guide dog Daisy lying peacefully beside him. He focused, his mind sharpening as he replayed the events in his memory, searching for any detail he had missed. His heightened senses, honed through years of living without sight, helped him recall every sound, every feeling from that fateful day. He remembered the faint hum of the summer breeze, the rustling of the trees, and the voices of the children in the park. He could still hear the screech of the car's tires, the panic in the air as the driver lost control. His mind lingered on the split second before the collision, the moment when Adam had been far away, not close enough to help. But Thomas had been there, guiding Daisy towards safety and using his instincts to pull Charlie from harm's way. A new thought sparked in his mind. What if the accident wasn't as random as it seemed? What if the driver hadn't swerved by accident? What if the cause of the crash had been something deeper, something that involved Adam's family more than Thomas had ever realized? Determined to find answers, Thomas reached for his phone and dialed Sarah's number. "Sarah," he began, his voice urgent, "I think I've figured something out. There's something about that day, something I'm missing. I need your help to find out what really happened." Sarah's voice was steady as always. "I'm with you, Thomas. We'll get to the bottom of this." With a new sense of purpose, Thomas began to feel the weight of his past lifting. The pain and uncertainty that had clouded his path for so long were slowly being replaced with the clarity he needed to move forward. He was no longer just a blind man who had been the victim of an accident. He was someone who was ready to face the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. Grace, watching him from a distance, felt a sense of admiration and hope blossom within her. She had always known Thomas was capable of so much more than his blindness suggested, but now she saw him in a new light. He was no longer a man defined by tragedy. He was a man on a mission. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, Thomas could feel the stage set for the resolution he had been seeking for years. The truth, no matter how painful, was within his grasp, and once he uncovered it, there would be no turning back. The air was thick with unease as Thomas, Adam, and Sarah stood near the edge of the park, the place where it had all happened, where Thomas's life had been irrevocably altered. The sounds of children playing and families chatting seemed distant, like a world Thomas could never fully return to. The breeze was gentle, but it did nothing to calm the tension hanging in the air. Adam stood a few feet away, his arms crossed tightly, his expression unreadable. Grace, who had come along, was holding Charlie's hand, her face a mix of concern and hope. She had urged Adam to come, believing this was the only way for him to confront the past, but she could see the storm brewing in his eyes. This wasn't going to be easy, and she could feel the weight of his reluctance. Thomas stood quietly, absorbing every detail. His heightened senses guided him. Every sound, every shift in the air seemed to speak to him in a way that made the past come alive again. The familiar place felt strangely foreign now. He could almost hear the echoes of the past, the screech of the tires, the panic in the air. "Are you sure about this?" Adam's voice broke the silence, heavy with doubt. Thomas turned toward him, meeting his eyes with a calm determination that seemed to unsettle Adam further. "We can't move forward without the truth, Adam," Thomas said, his voice steady but firm. "It's time to let go of what you think you know." For a moment, Adam didn't respond, his jaw clenched. But slowly he nodded, though his eyes remained filled with anger and uncertainty. They moved toward the street corner where the accident had happened. The memory of that day was alive in every step Thomas took, but this time, something felt different. This time, he wasn't helpless. This time, he was in control. As they reached the spot where the car had swerved, Thomas's cane tapped against the pavement, its rhythmic sound grounding him in the present. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening intently, his mind piecing together the fragments of the past. "Here," Thomas said, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. The car must have been coming at a much higher speed than we thought. It didn't just lose control. It was out of control. Sarah, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the group, nodded in agreement. "I've been looking at the details, Thomas. The skid marks don't add up. The driver was too panicked. Something else was going on." Adam frowned. "You're saying it wasn't just an accident?" Thomas shook his head. "No, there's more to it. I think someone was trying to force the car off course. Someone was involved in a way we never knew." The revelation hung in the air, and for the first time, Adam's tough exterior cracked slightly. "You think someone wanted it to happen?" His voice was filled with disbelief, his gaze darting nervously to the spot where the crash had occurred. For a moment, Thomas remained silent, his thoughts swirling. Then his voice cut through the stillness, low but intense. "I'm sure of it." The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but Adam seemed unable to accept it. His disbelief and frustration grew as he tried to make sense of what Thomas had just said. How could we have missed something like this? How could I have not seen it? Grace stepped closer to Adam, her hand on his arm in a gesture of support. "Adam, it's not your fault. We can't keep holding on to what happened. We have to look at the facts now. We can't change the past, but we can change how we move forward." Charlie, who had been quiet throughout the entire ordeal, tugged at his mother's hand. His small voice interrupted the conversation. "What's happening, Mommy? Is Uncle Thomas okay?" Grace knelt down to comfort him. "Yes, sweetie. Uncle Thomas is fine." The emotional intensity of the moment thickened. Grace's words, meant to reassure, seemed to do little to calm the underlying tension. Adam was still in turmoil, unable to reconcile the new evidence with his lifelong anger and resentment. He felt betrayed, as if everything he had believed up until this point had been a lie. Thomas, sensing the growing storm, turned back to the site of the accident, focusing on the details again. As he listened, he heard something faint, a small object buried in the dirt near the edge of the road. He bent down, his fingers brushing the ground, and then he felt it, a keychain half buried under a pile of leaves. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just any keychain. It was a distinctive one, with a symbol Thomas recognized immediately. It was a logo of a company that Adam had once been associated with, a company he had worked for before the accident. Adam turned when he saw Thomas holding the keychain, his face draining of color. "What is that?" Thomas didn't answer immediately, his mind racing as he realized the significance of what he had found. The keychain could be the link that would finally prove there was something more to the accident than what Adam had known, or been willing to accept. As the silence stretched on, the tension in the air grew unbearable. Grace's eyes darted between the two men, unsure of what would happen next. Would Adam face the truth, or would he continue to deny it? Would this keychain be the key to unlocking everything? Thomas held the keychain in his hand, feeling its weight, both literal and symbolic. "I think this belongs to the driver," he said softly, his voice heavy with realization. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Adam's face twisted with confusion and denial. "That's impossible. This has to be a mistake." But Thomas, unwavering in his belief, held the keychain up, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to find out who it belongs to. We need to uncover the truth." Adam, the emotional intensity of the moment reached a fever pitch. Adam's world was shifting beneath his feet, and for the first time, he was forced to question everything he had held onto for years. As Thomas stood there, his resolve strengthening, he knew that this keychain was just the beginning of the answers they had all been searching for. The suspense was unbearable, the truth just beyond reach. Would Adam accept the truth, or would the past remain shrouded in secrecy? The answers were within their grasp, but the emotional cost of uncovering them would be higher than any of them could have imagined. The tension between Thomas and Adam had reached a boiling point. The keychain still lay heavily in Thomas's hand, a symbol of the buried truth that now threatened to unravel everything Adam had believed about that fateful day. The silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. As Adam's eyes flickered between the keychain and Thomas, his face a mixture of disbelief, anger, and confusion. "Where did you find that?" Adam's voice was strained, a low growl of accusation. Thomas stepped closer, his cane tapping rhythmically on the pavement as he moved. His voice was calm but edged with emotion, the years of internal struggle finally finding their outlet. "It's the keychain from the car that caused the accident. It's connected to the driver, and it's tied to your past." Adam recoiled, his face twisting with the sharp sting of guilt. "No, that can't be. It's just a coincidence, Thomas. It has to be." But Thomas wasn't backing down. He raised his head high, his gaze steady, unwavering. "It's no coincidence. You've been holding on to the wrong truth all these years, Adam. You've blamed me for something that wasn't mine to carry. The driver. He was connected to your old company. You worked with him, didn't you? You knew him." The revelation hit Adam like a physical blow. His breath faltered, and for a moment, it seemed as if the ground had shifted beneath him. All the years of anger, the belief that Thomas was the one to blame for the accident, now seemed fragile, like the pieces of a shattered mirror. For a long moment, Adam said nothing. His eyes, once filled with unyielding anger, were now clouded with confusion and guilt. He ran a shaky hand through his hair, his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear. Grace stepped forward, her voice soft but firm, the weariness of the years they had spent in this emotional limbo evident in her tone. "Adam, it's time to let go of the anger. We've all suffered. Thomas lost everything that day, but we didn't see it, not fully. And neither did you." Charlie, holding on to his mother's side, looked up at the men, sensing the tension in the air. He was too young to understand the full weight of what was happening, but his innocent eyes could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Thomas, kneeling down to meet his gaze, gave him a small, reassuring smile before turning back to Adam. Adam looked at his family, Grace, Charlie, and the man who had saved his son's life. His chest tightened, and the guilt seemed to settle into his bones like a heavy weight, making it hard to breathe. His gaze moved from Thomas to the keychain in his hand, the connection between them undeniable now. He had never imagined that the man he had resented for so long had been nothing more than a victim of fate, a victim who had stepped in when no one else had. A single tear escaped Adam's eye, the first sign of vulnerability he had shown throughout the ordeal. He wiped it away quickly, but the gesture didn't go unnoticed. "Thomas," Adam finally spoke, his voice cracking under the pressure of the realization. I didn't know. I didn't know that the driver was part of my past. I couldn't see past my own anger to understand what really happened." His voice wavered as he continued. "You saved my son, and all I did was make you the villain in my mind. I'm so sorry." Thomas stood still, his heart heavy with the weight of Adam's apology, yet still filled with a quiet sense of relief. He hadn't expected this confrontation to be easy. He hadn't expected forgiveness to come so swiftly, nor had he anticipated the depths of Adam's own guilt. But the words were enough. They were a beginning. The truth was now out in the open. Grace stepped closer, her eyes filled with compassion. She placed a hand on Adam's arm, her voice a gentle plea. "Adam, we can't undo the past, but we can start anew. We've been living in the shadow of this grief for far too long. It's time to let go and heal." For a long moment, Adam stood frozen, his gaze locked onto the keychain in Thomas's hand. Then slowly, he turned to face Thomas. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can make up for all the years I spent hating you." Thomas's voice was calm, but filled with the weight of his own journey. "It's not about fixing everything, Adam. It's about understanding. We can't change what happened, but we can make sure it doesn't control us anymore. A long silence settled over them, each man caught in the gravity of their shared history. Adam's hand shook slightly as he reached out and, for the first time, extended his hand toward Thomas. The gesture was tentative, almost as if he were afraid that touching him would somehow make the years of animosity disappear. But it wasn't the touch that mattered. It was the acknowledgement, the understanding that they had both been hurt in different ways by the same event. Thomas reached out and took Adam's hand. The touch wasn't warm, not yet, but it was a beginning. A bridge between two men who had lived in the darkness for far too long, each believing the other had been the cause of their pain. The camera lingered on their clasped hands, a symbol of the fragile reconciliation that had begun between them. But the resolution was still distant, just out of reach. The audience could feel the emotional tension building, knowing that the true resolution, the final piece of this emotional puzzle, was still to come. As Adam and Thomas stood there, side by side, the weight of the past began to lift, but the journey toward true healing was far from over. And in that moment, as the camera zoomed in on their faces, there was a powerful sense of anticipation, of something significant yet to unfold. The emotional roller coaster was far from finished, and the viewers were left hanging on the precipice, eager to see where this fragile reconciliation would lead them in the final part of the story. The day of reconciliation had come, but the air still hung heavy with unspoken words and years of unresolved grief. Thomas and Adam stood at the edge of the park, where everything had started, and now, where it would end. The keychain still lay in Thomas's hand, its significance now understood. But what had seemed like an insurmountable divide between the two men was slowly beginning to close. Adam, who had spent years carrying the weight of blame and anger, stood with his shoulders slumped, a man broken by the realization that his own misconceptions had kept him from healing. The walls he had built around himself were crumbling, and in their place, something new was emerging, a vulnerability he had long suppressed. "Thomas," Adam began, his voice low but steady, "I don't know how to make up for the years I wasted hating you, for blaming you for something that was never your fault. I was wrong, and I know it. But the pain," he paused, his throat tight with emotion, "the pain made me blind to the truth." Thomas listened, his heart heavy but open. The years of resentment and hurt between them had been suffocating. But now, for the first time, he could hear the sincerity in Adam's voice. This wasn't just an apology. It was an acknowledgement of the truth, a willingness to confront the past and let it go. "I thought I could never forgive myself for that day," Adam continued, his eyes meeting Thomas's, searching for some kind of absolution. "But now, I see that the forgiveness wasn't just for you. It's for me too. I've spent all these years in a prison of my own making. I've locked myself away with the pain and anger." Grace, who had been quietly watching from a distance, stepped forward with Charlie by her side. Her eyes were moist, but there was a softness in her gaze as she watched her husband finally admit the truth, watched him let go of the guilt that had defined their lives for so long. Charlie, innocent and unaware of the depth of the emotional transformation unfolding before him, squeezed his mother's hand, sensing the shift. "Adam," Thomas said quietly, his voice filled with understanding, "you don't have to carry this anymore. Neither of us do. What happened, happened. But we don't have to keep holding on to the hurt." Adam's face crumpled as the weight of Thomas's words finally sank in. A choked sob escaped his throat, and for the first time he allowed himself to feel the full depth of his grief. He stepped forward, reaching for Thomas's hand, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I'm so sorry for all the pain I caused you," Adam whispered, his voice breaking as he took Thomas's hand in his own. "For everything." Thomas's heart swelled as he clasped Adam's hand tightly. In that moment, it was as if all the years of anger, all the years of blaming and holding on to the past, had been washed away by the simple, yet powerful act of forgiveness. He didn't need to speak the words back to Adam. The sincerity in his touch said everything. Behind them, Grace smiled through her tears, seeing her husband's pain finally lifted, seeing her family take the first steps toward healing. Charlie, looking up at her with innocent wonder, didn't fully understand the gravity of the moment, but he could feel the change in the air, the tension dissipating, replaced by a quiet peace. For Thomas, the realization that his actions had helped bring about this moment of reconciliation was overwhelming. He had started this journey filled with doubts. Doubts about his own worth, doubts about the impact he could make. But now, standing here with Adam, he understood that his choices, his willingness to act in the face of danger, had sparked something much bigger than he had ever imagined. He wasn't just a blind man stumbling through life. He was a catalyst for healing, for change. Adam's hand remained in his, and they stood there for a long moment, both men silently acknowledging the weight of the journey they had taken together, how far they had come. It was an emotional breakthrough, not just for Adam, but for Thomas as well. The power of forgiveness had brought them together, and in doing so, it had set them both free. Charlie tugged at his mother's sleeve, and when she turned to him, he beamed up at her with a big smile. "Mommy, are they friends now?" Grace chuckled softly, brushing away a tear as she knelt to him. "Yes, sweetie, they're friends now." The simple words filled the space with warmth, and for the first time, it felt like the family was truly coming together. No longer divided by past mistakes or guilt. They were united in the moment, ready to face the future together. Thomas's gaze shifted back to Adam. "We've both lost a lot, but I think we've also gained something. A new beginning." Adam nodded, his hand still resting firmly in Thomas's. "I never thought I'd say this, but thank you. You've done more for me than I could ever have imagined." As the camera zoomed out, capturing the quiet moment between the two men, the family behind them, there was a sense of calm, of resolution. The emotional climax had come and gone, but its impact would remain. For Thomas, Adam, and everyone involved, the journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, but the weight of the past had been lifted, and for the first time in years, there was hope. The screen faded to black, and the final words appeared. Sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones fought within, and only when we face them can we truly heal. The story was complete, but for those who had followed this emotional roller coaster, the message would linger long after the credits rolled. The emotional aftermath of the confrontation between Thomas and Adam left behind more than just a sense of closure. It laid the foundation for powerful lessons that transcended the boundaries of the story and resonated with everyone who had been part of the journey. As Thomas and Adam stood together, their shared pain and the forgiveness they had granted each other became a beacon of hope for the entire family and, by extension, the audience. At its core, the story was about the power of forgiveness. It was about shedding the burden of resentment and letting go of the past. Adam had carried the weight of guilt for years, wrongly blaming Thomas for an accident he didn't cause. But in the end, it was through acknowledging the truth and accepting responsibility for his own emotions that Adam found the peace he so desperately needed. It wasn't an easy path. It required vulnerability, an openness to face the uncomfortable truths that had been buried for so long. Forgiveness is often viewed as a gift we give to others, but in this case, it became clear that forgiveness is equally, if not more, a gift we give ourselves. Adam's apology, his willingness to let go of his anger, didn't just heal his relationship with Thomas. It healed him. It allowed him to release the emotional shackles that had kept him imprisoned in a prison of his own making. The story also delved into the power of courage, particularly in the face of adversity. Thomas, a blind man, had been written off by society in many ways. Yet, his actions defied the common stereotypes of people with disabilities. He didn't allow his blindness to define his limitations. Instead, he embraced his other senses, his memory, and his intuition to navigate a world that was, at times, hostile or indifferent to him. Through his bravery, Thomas not only saved a child's life, but also shattered misconceptions about what people with disabilities are capable of achieving. His courage was not just physical. It was emotional and psychological, a demonstration of the strength required to rise above society's assumptions. His role as a catalyst for change was undeniable. What seemed like a small act, rushing to save a child from danger, had far-reaching consequences, not only in terms of saving a life, but also in inspiring Adam to rethink his anger and prejudice. This was a ripple effect of courage. When one person steps forward, despite the odds, it inspires others to do the same. Adam's journey to forgiveness was sparked by Thomas's unwavering bravery, and Grace's own understanding of the complexities of the situation grew as she watched the men navigate their shared history. Through Thomas's act of courage, the entire family was impacted in ways that would last a lifetime. Forgiveness, courage, and the breaking down of stereotypes were central to the message of the story, but there was also an underlying theme of the importance of seeing beyond the surface. It's easy to judge others based on preconceived notions or past mistakes, but true growth occurs when we open our hearts to understand the full picture. Adam had judged Thomas based on his blindness, assuming he was incapable of being a hero. Yet, in the end, it was Thomas's actions that proved him wrong. The lesson was clear. We cannot allow labels or stereotypes to limit our understanding of others. As the family came together in the resolution of their conflict, it became evident that small acts of bravery, whether it's standing up for what's right, taking a chance to forgive, or simply offering a hand to someone in need, can have profound ripple effects. These acts inspire those around us to reflect on their own lives, to make changes, and to take action in ways they might not have before. Just as Thomas's intervention saved a child's life, his courage sparked a chain reaction that led to healing, understanding, and growth for everyone involved. The story underscored the universal truth that we all have the potential to make a difference, regardless of our circumstances. Whether we are facing personal challenges, societal prejudice, or simply the everyday struggles of life, it is our actions, our courage, our compassion, and our willingness to forgive that shape the world around us. In the final moments of the story, as the family stood united, Thomas's role as an agent of change became clear. He had not only saved a child's life, but had also brought about a transformative change in the lives of Adam, Grace, and even Charlie. It was a reminder that we are all capable of far more than we think, if we are willing to step forward, confront our fears, and embrace the power of forgiveness. As the screen faded to black, the lesson lingered. Courage can change the world. Forgiveness can heal wounds, and sometimes it's the smallest acts that have the most profound impact. In a world that often seems divided, these universal truths offer hope, reminding us that healing, growth, and understanding are always within reach, as long as we choose to take the first step. With the weight of the past finally lifted, the family began to forge a new path forward, one defined by healing, hope, and a renewed sense of purpose. For Thomas, the journey had not only freed him from the burden of his own doubts, but had opened up new possibilities for his future. He no longer saw himself as a man defined by his blindness or his tragic past. Instead, he rediscovered his love for music, his once-lost passion that had been overshadowed by the pain of his accident. One day, as he sat at an old piano in the corner of his small living room, his fingers hesitated over the keys. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of Daisy at his feet. For years, Thomas had abandoned music, convinced that his blindness would prevent him from ever playing again. But now, in this moment of peace and newfound strength, something within him stirred. He let his fingers flow over the keys, and the melody that emerged was both familiar and brand new. It was a sound filled with joy, redemption, and the quiet strength he had found through his journey. The music seemed to echo the harmony of his life, slowly coming back together. Thomas didn't just reconnect with his music. He also began to reconnect with the community around him. The park where the accident had happened had once been a place of fear and sadness for him, but now it was a space where he found solace and inspiration. He began playing music at local events, using his talents to raise awareness about the challenges people with disabilities face. His performances, though small at first, became an opportunity for him to share his story and to connect with others who had their own struggles. Adam and Grace, inspired by Thomas's transformation, found a new purpose of their own. They began volunteering at local schools and community centers to raise awareness about the importance of parenting and child safety. The tragic accident that had brought them all together was now fueling their desire to make a positive impact in their community. Grace, once consumed by guilt, found healing in her new mission to help other parents navigate the challenges of raising children in an unpredictable world. She and Adam worked side by side, speaking at events and organizing campaigns to educate families about safety measures and the importance of staying vigilant. Their partnership, which had once been strained by anger and regret, was now stronger than ever. Adam, who had long struggled with his own feelings of inadequacy, found a sense of fulfillment in working alongside his wife to make a difference. The once divided family was now united in a shared goal to help others, to raise awareness, and to ensure that the tragedy they had experienced would serve as a catalyst for positive change. As for Charlie and Daisy, their bond symbolized a new beginning. Charlie, who had once been the frightened child on the edge of disaster, had grown into a young boy filled with curiosity and hope. He no longer saw the world with the same innocence he had before, but he had gained something even more precious: a deep understanding of love, compassion, and the value of second chances. He often spent time with Daisy, playing in the yard and exploring the neighborhood, the two of them inseparable. Daisy, the loyal guide dog who had played such a pivotal role in Thomas's life, had now become a symbol of hope for Charlie. Together, they embodied the healing power of companionship and trust. There was a quiet beauty in their shared moments. Charlie would sit on the porch, reading a book aloud to Daisy, as if they were old friends with a lifetime of memories between them. Daisy, always by his side, would nuzzle him gently, her presence a constant reminder that even in the most difficult times, there is always room for healing and growth. For Thomas, the presence of Daisy in his life had taken on new significance. Not only had she been his faithful guide through the darkness, but now she was a part of his new chapter, a chapter filled with possibility and hope. She had guided him to a place of self-acceptance, and now she was helping him find his way back to his music, his community, and his future. As the family came together for a quiet dinner one evening, Thomas looked around the table at the faces of those he had once felt so distant from. There was Adam, no longer the angry man he had once been, but a father who had reconciled with his past. There was Grace, her heart healed, her guilt replaced by a sense of purpose and strength. And there was Charlie, now a happy, healthy child, with a bond to Daisy that was unbreakable. Thomas smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. The scars of the past were still there, but they were no longer wounds that defined him. They were marks of growth, reminders of how far he had come. And in this moment, surrounded by the family he had helped heal, he knew that the journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. With a final glance at Daisy, who lay contentedly at his feet, Thomas stood and walked over to the piano. He sat down and began to play once more, the music flowing effortlessly, the notes now carrying with them the promise of new beginnings and brighter days ahead. The story had come full circle, and in its resolution, it offered the most satisfying of closures: the promise of hope, healing, and the power of love to transform even the darkest of pasts into a bright future. As the music echoed through the room, the screen faded to black and the words appeared. Every story has its beginning, but it is in the moments of healing that the true journey unfolds. As the final chapter of the story unfolded, it was clear that Thomas had not only overcome the challenges of the past, but had also transformed into a symbol of resilience and hope for those around him. The scene opened in the park where the journey had started, the place of both tragedy and triumph. It was now the setting for a new beginning, a testament to how far Thomas had come. Thomas, now confident and at peace with himself, sat at a piano placed in the park, its keys worn but full of meaning. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the sound of the music that began to fill the air. There was a quiet excitement in the crowd, but it was more than just an ordinary performance. It was the culmination of a journey filled with struggles, growth, and healing. As Thomas's fingers moved across the keys, the melody that poured out was rich with emotion, a reflection of his journey, a song of redemption and hope. Each note seemed to carry with it the weight of his past, but also the promise of the future. The park, once a place where he had felt isolated and alone, now felt like a homecoming. The familiar sounds of laughter from children playing and the rustling of leaves in the trees blended seamlessly with his music, creating a symphony of life, growth, and renewal. The onlookers, some familiar faces from his past and others new to him, listened in quiet reverence. They were there not just to hear the music, but to witness the story that had brought them together. In the crowd, Adam and Grace stood side by side, holding hands, their expressions filled with pride and admiration. Charlie, standing next to Daisy, had a smile that reached his eyes, his hand gently resting on the dog's back. The family, once torn apart by anger and guilt, was now united in a way that was deeper than ever before. As Thomas played, the camera slowly panned across the crowd, capturing the faces of those who had been touched by his courage, his music, and the story that had unfolded before them. Their eyes reflected a mixture of awe and gratitude, as if they too had been part of this healing process, inspired by Thomas's ability to rise above his pain and turn it into something beautiful. Just as the music reached its emotional crescendo, the screen faded out, and the sound of the piano played on, softly in the background. Grace's voice, calm and reflective, began to narrate over the fading melody. Kindness, sometimes, feels like a small spark in a dark world. We often forget how one small act of courage, one moment of compassion, can ripple out and change everything. Thomas didn't set out to change the world. He only wanted to help. But through his bravery, his heart, and his unwavering belief in doing what's right, he touched lives in ways he never imagined. And in return, his life was changed too. It's a reminder that the power to heal, to forgive, and to grow is always within our reach. We don't need to be perfect. We just need to choose to be kind, to be brave, and to believe in the beauty of second chances. And that, I think, is what makes life truly remarkable. The music slowly faded, leaving only the soft sounds of the park in the background, a peaceful moment of reflection that lingered in the hearts of the viewers. The screen went dark, and the message of the story resonated long after the credits rolled. Sometimes, the greatest transformations come not from what we lose, but from what we find along the way. Choose kindness, choose courage, and the world will be a better place for it. The screen then flashed one final image. Thomas, standing tall with his piano, surrounded by a community that had once been strangers, but was now his extended family, united by shared moments of healing, growth, and understanding. And as the credits began to roll, viewers were left with the inspiration to reflect on their own lives, the power of forgiveness, and the profound impact that simple acts of kindness can have on the world. The story of Thomas, Adam, Grace, and Charlie was not just their own. It was a reminder that we all have the power to change the course of our own journeys and, in doing so, inspire others to do the same.